You know, sometimes life drops a bombshell on your doorstep without any warning at all, turning what should have been just another peaceful morning into the opening scene of a personal war you never signed up for. That crisp, ordinary dawn in Cedarwood Heights, our quiet little suburban enclave nestled safely away from the noise and rush of the city, where the first pale light of sunrise gently touches the perfectly edged lawns, where birds announce the new day with their bright, cheerful songs, blending perfectly with the soft, rhythmic hiss of automatic sprinklers coming to life across the neighborhood, where everything feels calm, predictable, almost reassuringly mundane, until I pushed open the front door, the warmth of my coffee mug still comforting in my palm, expecting nothing more complicated than the usual start to another day, only to discover that violation notice taped aggressively to the door itself. The bold black print accusing me in no uncertain terms of the outrageous, almost comical crime of permitting one solitary leaf to remain on my driveway, as though that single, innocent piece of autumn debris was a deliberate, calculated assault on the entire community's aesthetic integrity, my stomach instantly knotting itself into a tight ball of disbelief mixed with a slow-burning, rising anger, the comfortable illusion of tranquility exploding into sharp fragments that cut deep, dragging me unwillingly but irrevocably into a conflict that would soon consume far more of my time, energy, and peace of mind than I ever imagined possible. And standing at the very center of this storm was Loretta, the undisputed, self-crowned empress of the Cedarwood HOA, marching up and down the streets with that ever-present clipboard gripped tightly in her hand like a royal decree made physical, her sharp eyes constantly scanning for the slightest deviation from her personal vision of suburban perfection, inventing new rules on a whim whenever the existing ones didn't quite serve her purpose, not acting as any kind of genuine steward of community standards, but rather as someone who clearly lived for the intoxicating rush that comes from wielding power over others, from watching neighbors shrink and comply under the weight of her judgment, her voice always carrying that subtle but unmistakable undertone of condescension. Every single interaction carefully calibrated to remind you exactly who was in charge and who was expected to fall in line. At first, I tried to dismiss it completely, convincing myself that this was nothing more than one isolated, bizarre incident that would blow over quickly. But when I finally gathered enough composure to approach her directly, standing by the low fence that separated our properties and speaking in the calmest, most reasonable tone I could manage while explaining that one fallen leaf could hardly be considered a threat to the entire neighborhood's harmony, she met my words with an icy stare that made it very clear she considered any discussion a waste of her valuable time, simply repeating that rules are rules, that she alone interprets them, and that her decision was final with no room for negotiation. And in that precise instant, something fundamental shifted inside me. Not a hot flash of uncontrollable rage, but rather a cold, focused, almost surgical determination taking root deep in my chest. Because if Loretta truly believed that I would simply lower my head, accept her authority, without question, and allow her to trample across the home I had worked so many long years to purchase, the home where my wife and I are raising our children, where every room holds memories of laughter, tears, first steps, and quiet family nights, then she had made a serious, almost catastrophic miscalculation about the kind of man she was dealing with. Before Loretta's shadow began stretching longer and darker across every corner of the neighborhood, Cedarwood Heights truly embodied everything people dream about when they think of the perfect American suburb: children pedaling their bikes fearlessly down the gently curving streets, their bright laughter echoing off the neat rows of houses like the happiest kind of music, neighbors greeting one another warmly over white picket fences or while watering flowers in the front yard. Weekend barbecues sending clouds of charcoal-scented smoke drifting lazily through the air while people shared stories, jokes, and plates of homemade potato salad. The HOA functioning exactly as it should, as a light, helpful framework that encouraged tidiness and consideration without ever suffocating individuality or turning daily life into a constant performance of compliance. The very place my wife and I had chosen years earlier when we wanted to put down real roots, where our kids could learn to ride bikes on safe sidewalks, where summer evenings were spent sitting on the porch swing watching fireflies dance in the twilight, where every small, ordinary moment felt wrapped in a blanket of security and genuine belonging. Then the violations started arriving, at first so minor they almost seemed accidental, then gradually escalating into something far more absurd and vindictive. Warnings about grass that was slightly overgrown, even though I had mowed it meticulously just the day before, citations for a mailbox that was a fraction of an inch off vertical, even though no one else could detect any tilt at all. Fines for leaving the trash cans at the curb 7 minutes past the official pickup deadline. Garden gnomes suddenly classified as aesthetic violations because their painted smiles and whimsical hats apparently clashed with Loretta's rigidly enforced idea of acceptable yard decor, each new notice landing on my doorstep like a fresh slap to the face, each one more petty and unreasonable than the last. And Loretta didn't merely enforce existing rules, she actively invented new ones whenever the mood struck her, changing interpretations overnight, creating exceptions for herself while holding everyone else to impossible standards, effectively turning herself into the sole, living embodiment of the law within our community, her word absolute, her decisions beyond challenge or appeal. She singled me out deliberately, making my house her daily project, driving past slowly every single morning and afternoon, clipboard always at the ready, openly jotting down notes while staring directly at my windows, transforming me into the neighborhood's designated troublemaker, the one resident who apparently threatened the entire community's harmony simply by existing. Every fallen leaf on my property suddenly treated as hard evidence of my ongoing rebellion, the relentless surveillance, slowly poisoning the atmosphere inside our home, turning what used to be relaxed family dinners into tense, whispered conversations, my wife beginning to worry aloud about every toy left in the yard, every curtain left slightly open, our children starting to ask innocent but heartbreaking questions about why that lady always seems to be watching our house so closely. The accumulating weight of this injustice gnawing away at me during the quiet hours after everyone else had gone to bed, leaving me staring at the ceiling, feeling the slow burn of something that was equal parts anger and profound sadness. The deeper I looked into her behavior, the more obvious the truth became. Loretta had no real interest in making the neighborhood more beautiful or cohesive. She was simply addicted to the psychological high that came from exercising power over other people. Her own driveway, frequently marred by a rusty, ancient car that clearly violated multiple parking regulations, the exterior paint on her house peeling in large, visible strips, yet she always managed to grant herself complete immunity from any criticism or penalty. And when I finally brought printed copies of the official HOA bylaws to our next encounter, highlighting the exact sections that should have applied equally to everyone, she simply dismissed them with a condescending laugh and the casual remark that those are really just guidelines. They're open to reasonable interpretation. And in that single moment, every last shred of logic and fairness I had been clinging to completely collapsed around me, leaving only the stark realization that this entire campaign had never been about grass height or leaf placement or gnome placement at all. It was about one thing and one thing only: control, raw and unfiltered, a sustained power trip where Loretta got her daily dose of dominance by making her neighbors feel small, powerless, and constantly on edge. And because I had dared to question her authority, because I had refused to simply nod and comply, I had officially become her primary target, the one resident who had to be broken in order to prove that her throne remained unchallenged. I made the conscious decision right then that I would not descend to her level of direct confrontation or petty retaliation, instead choosing to beat her at her own game by following every single rule with such meticulous, almost obsessive precision that it would eventually drive her to the edge of sanity without ever giving her legitimate grounds to strike back effectively. So I began constructing an elaborate, fully HOA-approved storage shed specifically designed to house the trash cans in. Perfect compliance with every dimension, material requirement, and setback rule ever written, followed by the creation of an entire miniature gnome village in the front yard. Every single figure carefully measured and positioned to fall within the exact allowable height, spacing, and aesthetic guidelines she herself had previously cited. And then, in what still feels like one of my quieter moments of poetic justice, I repainted our front door in precisely the same shade of muted sage green that she had once publicly praised as the perfect example of tasteful neighborhood color. Watching from behind the curtains as her face contorted first in confusion, then in barely concealed fury when she realized she could find no violation to cite without exposing her own hypocrisy. Every step of this carefully orchestrated campaign of hyper-compliance I documented with the thoroughness of someone building a legal case, saving every single email she sent dripping with her trademark condescension, photographing every one of her own ongoing violations with timestamp precision, compiling a growing dossier that became thicker and heavier with each passing week. My late nights spent in the dim glow of the laptop screen reviewing every detail, feeling a strange combination of mounting tension and grim, almost dark satisfaction as I watched Loretta's once-iron composure begin to fracture, her finds arriving in increasingly frantic waves, her written threats growing more desperate and less coherent. Yet now, for the first time since this nightmare began, I held a real advantage because I possessed something she never expected anyone to gather: irrefutable, documented proof of her double standards and abuses. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the rest of the neighborhood began to wake up to what was happening. Neighbors who had previously kept their heads down and their complaints private started approaching me during evening walks or over backyard fences, sharing their own accumulated stories of mistreatment. Howard quietly telling me about the ridiculous fine he received when his elderly cat wandered across a patch of communal grass. Mabel confessing with visible hurt how her beautiful holiday wreaths were ordered removed because they were judged excessively festive and therefore disruptive to the street's aesthetic harmony. Percy grumbling in his deep, gravelly voice about how his large American flag, the one he proudly flew every national holiday, had been labeled oversized and threatened with removal, each personal story adding another thread to the growing tapestry of shared resentment, transforming what had been isolated, private frustrations into something collective, something powerful, something that began to feel like the first stirrings of genuine solidarity. Our resistance took shape in ways that were deliberately playful yet surgically pointed. No trespassing, especially for cats, signs appearing in windows and yards across the block, holiday wreaths growing larger, more elaborate, and more numerous with each passing week, American flags hoisted higher than ever before and illuminated at night with bright floodlights that turned darkness into defiant daylight. Loretta visibly spiraling as she tried to respond with a blizzard of new citations and increasingly hysterical warnings. But the fear that had once kept everyone silent had evaporated almost overnight, replaced instead by quiet laughter, knowing glances exchanged across lawns, and a growing, almost electric sense of unity that tasted like long-delayed freedom finally within reach. The absolute breaking point arrived one early morning before most people were even awake. When Loretta finally crossed the one line she could never uncross, sneaking onto my private property in the dim pre-dawn light with a measuring tape at her hand, crouching down to measure individual blades of grass in what was clearly an act of blatant, deliberate trespass. An invasion so brazen and so personal that it stole the breath from my lungs when I first saw her through the gap in the curtains, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs as a combination of white-hot fury and deep, aching sorrow washed over me in waves, because this was no longer about neighborhood regulations or aesthetic standards. This was a direct assault on the most sacred space my family had, the yard where my children chase each other and build forts, where my wife and I sit together on summer nights talking about our dreams, where we feel safest and most ourselves, and every second of her intrusion was captured in unforgiving high-definition clarity by the security cameras I had installed months earlier, creating a permanent, time-stamped record that left no room for denial or excuse. Fueled by that single, undeniable moment of overreach, I plunged even deeper into the official Cedarwood HOA bylaws, reading and cross-referencing every clause, every amendment, every footnote with the intensity of someone preparing for the most important trial of their life, carefully comparing Loretta's long list of personal violations against the very rules she claimed to champion, building an airtight, comprehensive case that grew stronger and more devastating with every page I turned. The tension inside our home reaching almost unbearable levels as the day of the decisive HOA meeting approached, the community center feeling more like a courtroom than a gathering place when the evening finally arrived, chairs filled to capacity, the air thick with anticipation and unspoken anxiety. Loretta entering with her usual air of unassailable authority, carrying a massive binder she proudly labeled neighborhood offenders, her voice ringing out confidently as she presented what she clearly believed was an airtight case against me and the small but growing group of residents who had begun to push back against her reign. When my name was called, I stood slowly, deliberately, holding a folder that was noticeably thicker than hers, my hand steady despite the pounding of my heart, calmly distributing copies of my documentation to every board member present, then reading aloud in a clear, measured tone the specific clause that had always been there, but rarely enforced. The one stating in plain language that any member of the board found to be in serious violation of the association's own rules shall be immediately removed from their position, the words hanging heavily in the suddenly silent room like a guillotine blade suspended in mid-air, and then the chairperson's voice cutting through the stillness, calm, professional, but utterly final. Loretta, based on the evidence presented and the clear language of our bylaws, you are hereby removed from the board, effective immediately. Her face drained of all color in an instant, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as she tried to form protests that refused to come, the overwhelming weight of the documented evidence and the room's stunned silence pressing down on her until she finally turned and walked out, head bowed for the first time anyone could remember, leaving behind a stunned hush that slowly dissolved into quiet, incredulous murmurs, and then, finally, scattered but unmistakable applause. The consequences unfolded with the swiftness and finality of justice long delayed. Loretta hit with counterfines that mirrored the petty tactics she had used against so many others, formal legal warnings issued for multiple instances of trespassing on private property, her once feared reputation collapsing in a matter of days as word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, and within weeks the inevitable for sale sign appeared in her front yard, followed soon after by moving trucks. Then emptiness. She was gone, vanished without ceremony or farewell, leaving behind only the faint echo of her former power and no one who truly mourned her departure. We celebrated the way a community celebrates when it finally exhales after holding its breath for far too long, throwing the largest, loudest block party Cedarwood Heights had ever seen, grills sending up clouds of savory smoke, music playing from speakers set up in driveways, strings of colorful lights twinkling overhead like stars brought down to earth. A massive inflatable gnome standing triumphantly in the middle of the cul-de-sac as our unofficial mascot of victory, people hugging, laughing, sharing stories of endurance and small acts of courage. The weight that had pressed down on every household for months finally lifting, allowing genuine joy to rush back in like fresh air into a sealed room. The HOA itself was reborn under new, fair-minded leadership. Old rules simplified or eliminated entirely. The focus shifted to practical improvements like repairing streetlights that had been neglected for years, organizing real community events that actually brought people together instead of dividing them, transforming the association back into what it was always supposed to be, a group working for the benefit of the community rather than the ego of one person. And in a quiet corner of the common green space, we placed a small, deliberately humorous monument, a miniature statue of Loretta holding a tiny clipboard, positioned forever beside a cheerful, grinning gnome, with a simple inscription that read, in memory of the fallen dictator, not intended as cruelty, but as a gentle, ongoing reminder to everyone that even small amounts of power, when combined with an oversized ego, can become toxic and destructive. And that truth, careful adherence to law, and genuine unity among neighbors can ultimately bring down even the most entrenched tyrant. Now, sitting on our front porch as the sun slowly sinks behind the rooftops, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, watching my children run and laugh freely across the yard without fear of being watched or judged, my wife beside me with that same quiet, contented smile I fell in love with so many years ago, I feel a profound, complete sense of closure. The injustice that once threatened to define our lives finally answered. The home we love reclaimed. The family sanctuary restored. The nightmare over at last. But even with that peace, I still find myself wondering, and I genuinely love to hear what you think. Was standing up and fighting back the way I did an act of true justice? Or does it inevitably cross some invisible line when the line between defense and revenge starts to blur? At what point does protecting your family, your home, and your basic rights become excessive? Is banding together as a community to remove a bully the right and moral path forward? Or is there wisdom sometimes in simply walking away, cutting your losses, and moving on to preserve your own peace? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read everyone, and I'm really curious to know where you stand on this.